Shalom, everybody. James Trim here, and today I want to talk to you about the reason that we have four Gospels. There's some very special reasons for that there are four, not two or three. In fact, if you watched my previous video on the good news according to the Hebrews, or the Gospel according to the Hebrews, I'll put a link down in the comments. There's actually five Gospels. The original Gospel according to the Hebrews, which was the original Jewish Gospel. It's been lost. We have about 50 fragments of it that are found in the so-called Church Fathers, in quotations in those and in margins of manuscripts and whatnot, and we have enough information, go back and watch that video, to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's a project that we are working on here. But today I want to talk about why we have surviving to us four Gospels, and the very special reasons that there are four Gospels. Before I get started, though, I need to ask you please to consider supporting this work financially. This takes time and effort, and a lot of time and effort. And for those that don't know, my wife is disabled. She's chronically ill, and she suffers from chronic pain. And I'm her full-time caretaker at home, in addition to doing this very important work. And so we need your financial support to help us and to help make these things happen. And you can donate by sending donations to donations@wnae.org. That's donations@wnae.org. We'll also put a link in the comments under the in the description of the video. Sorry, we'll put a link in the description of the video with a where you can donate. You can just click on it and donate there. We have had only, as of today, which is October 16th of 2021, in the last 11 days, we have had only 2 donations totaling $60. So you try and live on that. Okay, that's we need some of you to step up to the plate and make some donations and buy me some groceries. And our electric bill is actually past due right now. We need to get that paid, and we've got bills hitting our account, clearing our account Monday, and I've got to pick up a medication for my wife that is almost $250. That's our cost after the insurance, and I have to pick that up by Thursday because she has to take her next dose by Thursday. Basically, she doesn't have enough to last until after Thursday. So by Thursday, I have to have picked up her new medication, so she'll have her next dose on time. And that's very important. She can't just skip or miss it. So please consider donating to support this work. And now we're going to go into the study. And for a change today, I don't have any handouts. I started putting handouts for this together, and it just really wasn't working out real well that I needed them. So why push for handouts that aren't really needed? The only thing I would have made maybe a handout out of in the end was Pardous. So what is Pardous? Pardous is an acronym for Peshat in Hebrew, Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. These are 4 levels of understanding of the scriptures in Judaism, and the spell, because we don't have written vowels in Hebrew, they form an acronym, or what we call in Hebrew a notarikon. In Judaism it's called a notarikon, for Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, for Pardous. Pardous is the Hebrew word for paradise or an orchard, and it is from which we get our word paradise, actually. All right. So this reminds us then that a full understanding of the scriptures on all four levels is likened to paradise, likened to Pardus. And each level of understanding gets progressively deeper, like the layers of an onion become more intense. So the first level of understanding is Peshat. Now, there's a reason we're going over this, because there is a direct parallel between these four levels of understanding and the four Gospels. So the first level of understanding is Peshat. Peshat is a Hebrew word that means simple, and the Peshat is the plain, literal, simple meaning of the text. It's just what the text says without adding any additional interpretive effort whatsoever. Just plain and simple what it simply says, literally. The remez, the word remez means hinted or implied, is the hinted, inferred, or implied meaning of the text. A good example would be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The remez would be to say, to apply that also to ears. It doesn't say anything about ears. So in the Peshat, it doesn't say anything about ears, just eyes and teeth. But we may, by implication, carry it forward and apply it to ears as well. That's remez. Drosh is the next level of understanding. Drosh is the allegorical or homiletical meaning of the text. And so it's the word drosh means to search, and it comes from a root meaning to thrash. It has this idea of taking the text and thrashing it like wheat and getting every little bit of the grain out of it, all the good stuff out. And it's from where we get the word midrash, which is literally from drosh. It's a noun constructed by adding a mem as almost sort of a prefix, but it's not really a prefix. It's a form of word, if you will. But it's similar to the idea of mem for from drosh. And it is the result of drosh, of searching the text, of thrashing the text. And like I said, it's the allegorical or homiletical meaning of the text. And then the highest level of understanding is the sod level, which is the hidden, secret, or mystical meaning of the text. And an example of that, for example, would be when the scriptures talk about the number 666. That's a numerical value in Hebrew. Words and that in Hebrew, letters are also numbers. So words are also have numerical values. So the number 666 has some hidden, secret, or mystical meaning that's being given to us. I could give many more examples of these, but we're not doing a hermeneutics class right now. We're just kind of doing a brief overview of these four levels of understanding. So then I can show you how the four Gospels that we have present us the life of Yeshua, an account, a gospel, if you will. Each of them present an interpretation of the original gospel, the gospel according to the Hebrews, on each of the four levels of understanding. Now, there's two reasons that we have four gospels. This is two primary reasons. This is the first one. So we'll go over this one first, and then we'll go over the second one, which is also gives us some insight into the text of the Gospels themselves. Okay, so Mark, we're going to start with it, not because it's the first Gospel chronologically, and contrary to opinion, as you'll find out if you go back and listen to the or watch the Restoration of the Gospel according to the Hebrews video, Mark is not the source gospel for the synoptic gospels, so it's not the first gospel to be composed either. However, Mark gives the Peshat. Mark gives the plain, simple version of the story. Mark's gospel is short. It doesn't delve into the details well, like Luke does, and we'll get into that in a minute. Um, and unlike Matthew, Mark doesn't constantly, he very comparatively rarely cites passages from the Tanakh. Mark, well, we're going to talk about, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So that's Mark. Mark is the simple, plain version of the story. Now, then there's Luke. Luke gives the remez. Dr. Luke, the physician. Contrary to popular teachings out there, by the way, Luke was not a Greek. He was, according to Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history, an Assyrian from Antioch. So his native language would have been, by the way, Syriac or Aramaic, not Greek. And Luke gives the remez level because Dr. Luke digs into the details and gives a more detailed account of Yeshua's life than Mark does. Matthew gives us the drash level of understanding. That's because Matthew tells the story of the life of Yeshua and the teachings of Yeshua as a midrash on various scriptures from the Tanakh. In fact, the book of Matthew dozens of times quotes the Tanakh, oftentimes using the formula, thus was fulfilled the passage saying, or thus was fulfilled the scripture which says, something of that nature. So Matthew is presenting to us a midrash on passages of the Tanakh. So it's the drash level of understanding. And then Yochanan gives us the sod level of understanding. John explores the hidden mystical level of the Messiah as the memra, or the Word incarnate. And in fact, even opens up with that theme. Yochanan, or John, talks about the Messiah as being the not only the Word, but the light and the truth and the life and the way and so on. Very abstract, mystical terms. He also has a mystical interpretation that he gives of the bronze serpent that was set up in the wilderness, representing Yeshua as the Messiah. So these are the four levels of understanding that make up Pardous, and that the full understanding is likened onto Pardous. So we have a full understanding. So while the Gospel according to the Hebrews hasn't survived in its totality, what has survived are four interpretations of it, if you will, four interpretations of the life of Yeshua anyway, each of which gives us one of the levels of understanding, and which in their combined form give us the full understanding on all four levels. So that's why we have four Gospels. There's another reason that we have four Gospels. The four Gospels are written on not only on each of the four levels of understanding, but they are targeted to four different audiences. And it's uncanny how perfectly each of the Gospels niches one of the major audiences. Mark was written to the Gentiles, the Goyim. We read in 1 Kepha chapter 5, verse 13, that Mark was with Kepha in Babylon. Now, early Christians reinterpreted Babylon here to mean Rome. However, in the Church of the East and in some of the Eastern churches, they take Babylon to mean Babylon. Isn't that peculiar? Babylon just means Babylon. Babylon was the area of the Babylonian captivity and the area from which the Babylonian Talmud would later be edited, redacted, and compiled. At that particular time, and for a long time actually, that was the largest Jewish population in the world living there in Babylon. In fact, there were three major centers of Jewish population in the first century: Alexandria, Egypt, from which Philo of Alexandria hailed, the land of Israel and Judea and Jerusalem, where the probably the second largest, if not the third largest population lived, surprisingly, and the largest population of Jews in the world at that time and for a long time. In fact, I believe until the 19th century, um, was the area known as of the Babylonian captivity, modern Iraq, uh, in that area, modern Iraq and Iran. Um, so that's the area from which it was written. Mark, as Kepha's companion, seems to have felt the need for a short, concise version of the story, short, concise account for a Gentile audience that didn't make a whole lot of use of the Tanakh. Um, it wasn't trying to build on the Jewish foundation that the person already had because they didn't have one. And it was just very short and concise. um, Matthew was written to, what we have left are three more Gospels, and they were written to each of the three major sects of Judaism. Matthew wrote his Gospel for the Pharisees. And let me explain why. First of all, um, as we said before, Matthew is presented as a midrash, and all these things are more closely associated with their Pharisees than any of the other sects of Judaism. Uh, Matthew also concerns himself far more with issues of halakha than any of the other Gospels. What is halakha? Halakha is the way we do things in Judaism, how we carry out the Torah. Halakha was the focus of the Pharisees. The Pharisees focused on halakha, the Essenes focused on mysticism, but the Pharisees focused on halakha. That was their specialty. And Matthew deals with that far more than any of the others. In Matthew chapter 5, we've talked before on Yeshua's halakha, how Matthew is presenting us with several examples of how Yeshua builds a fence around the Torah in Matthew chapter 5, which is a very Pharisaic concept. Matthew chapter 6 deals with halakhic issues surrounding prayer and fasting and almsgiving. Matthew chapter 12 deals with halakha concerning the Sabbath and when the Sabbath is loosed. Then in Matthew chapter 15, we have the problem that is also presented in the Mishnah of the when there's a conflict between whether to honor one's parents or to keep a vow, if one has to do one or the other, which one takes priority. This is a Mishnaic problem, and it's dealt with in Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 19 deals with the issue of divorce, and in much the same way as the Mishnah does in the dispute between Hillel and Shammai on the same issue. And Matthew chapter 23 deals with a number of halakhic issues, especially vows that are made by euphemism. We'll do a teaching on that someday. Okay, but these are all halakhic issues. These are all of great interests to to people from a Pharisaic background in the Second Temple era, and these are the subjects that were the prelude to the Talmud. Okay, then we get to Luke. The book of Luke was written for a Sadducee audience, specifically Theophilus. But it's important to know and realize that in the Second Temple era, the majority of priests, almost all of them, were Sadducees. They dominated the priesthood. And Theophilus was, and a lot of you, this will be new information for a lot of you. Theophilus was the high priest from 37 to 42 CE. He was also, by the way, the son of Ananias. So he was the of Annas. Yeah, he was, according to Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 5, Section 3. He was one of the high priests. He served as high priest during that time. Now, in that time period, the high priests didn't serve for life, as the Torah says that they should. Rather, they were kind of up for to the highest bidder, and the Roman Empire decided who was going to be and hold the office of high priest, regardless of whether they were of the Zadok line or not. So Theophilus was the high priest from 37 to 42 CE. And so when Luke writes to a noble, apparently, honorable Theophilus, he's from a Jewish perspective, he's clearly writing to the high priest. And there's also information in Luke and Acts, which is really second Luke, if you will, because Acts was also written by Luke as a follow-up, written also to Theophilus. And there's a tremendous amount of material in the Luke Acts material to indicate that it was written with special emphasis on the priesthood and the Sadducees. He begins his story with Zechariah's vision of the angel in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 through 25, which is taking place in the temple. So he starts right there in the temple with Zechariah's vision of the angel. Then, before long, he covers Miriam's purification and Yeshua's redemption rituals in the temple in chapter 2, verses 21 through 39. And then, in chapter 2, verse 46, he covers Yeshua teaching in the temple when he was just 12 years old. All of this is really well aimed at Theophilus as the high priest, because Theophilus was a child growing up in the temple during that time, and he would have been privy to and maybe even seen some of these things as a child. So this was reaching out and appealing to his childhood and his time that he spent in the temple when his father was high priest. Okay. Another reason this may be aimed at Pharisees, Sadducees, is the parable of the Good Samaritan that appears in Luke. Also, the Gospel of Luke soft sells Caiaphas's involvement in the crucifixion. In fact, not only does it soft sell Caiaphas's involvement in the crucifixion, it doesn't even mention Caiaphas's involvement in the crucifixion, which is an interesting oversight unless one is soft selling it and trying to appeal to Theophilus, the high priest, with this account. And Luke seems to want to emphasize the resurrection in chapter 24, verse 39. Luke tells the story of doubting Thomas, who doesn't believe the resurrection until he actually reaches and touches the physical body of Yeshua and puts his finger in the nail print where he was pierced. That's the degree to which the resurrection is emphasized in because the Sadducees rejected the resurrection. They didn't just reject the resurrection of Yeshua, they rejected resurrection, period. They didn't believe in anybody's resurrection. Whereas so it was very important in Luke in writing his account to him to emphasize that the resurrection of Yeshua was a reality and that it actually happened. And then the fourth gospel is Yochanan or John, and John writes his gospel aimed at the Essenes because the Essenes were concerned with things that were mystical, the secret things, the hidden things. They were mystics. And so Yochanan talks about, as we said earlier, Yeshua as the incarnation of the Word and as the way incarnate. And the Essenes called themselves the way, and they identified themselves with the passage in Isaiah which talks about making a way for Yahweh in the wilderness. Yochanan also identifies Yeshua as the truth and the light and the life in very mystical terms that would have been very appealing to the Essenes. So John. Yochanan writes the Essenes. So this is why we have four Gospels. Two reasons. The first, to summarize, is that we have the account of the life of Yeshua on all four levels of understanding, and basically interpretations of the Gospel according to the Hebrews on all four levels of understanding. The Peshat, the literal meaning, the Remez, the implied, digging into the details meaning, the Drosh, the Midrashic meaning, and the Sod, the hidden secret and allegorical meaning. Similar to this, but not quite the same, we also have that the four Gospels are aimed at four different audiences. Mark wrote his Gospel for Gentiles who were just being approached with the story and didn't have a lot of background in the Tanakh and whatnot, and just needed a real short account. Matthew wrote an account aimed at the Pharisees, or directed at Pharisees, that presents the story as a midrash on the Tanakh, and uses, in fact, formal forms of midrashic exegesis in places. And also talks about halakha, which is something that the Pharisees were particularly concerned with, much more than any of the other Gospels. And then Luke writes his Gospel to Theophilus specifically, and generally, therefore, to the priesthood and the Sadducees especially. So a Sadducean audience. And he emphasizes things related to the temple. He also, by the way, forgot to mention, Luke is the one that actually talks about Yeshua's teaching in the temple regularly. As Yeshua saying, "Did I not teach in the temple?" and whatnot. A lot of emphasis on the temple, scenes in the temple that involve the priesthood, the parable of the Good Samaritan, which involves the priesthood, and emphasizes the resurrection as a very literal, physical resurrection, with the account of doubting Thomas to answer and respond to the Sadducean position of not believing in resurrection at all. And then finally, the fourth gospel, Yochanan, is written to the audience of the Essenes who were concerned with things that were hidden, secret, and mystical. And so he gives the hidden, secret, mystical interpretation. Okay, so there we have four gospels and four meanings, four reasons why we have four gospels. So I hope that will help you as you study each of the four gospels to understand the audience to which each was written, and why Matthew is concentrating on halakha, and why Matthew is presenting midrash, and why he's often giving allegorical interpretations of Tanakh passages, like out of Egypt I've called my son, which, if you look back in Hosea, is actually talking literally about Israel, but midrashically Matthew applies it to the Messiah, Yeshua, and there's several other examples, and why he concentrates so much on halakhic issues. Um, and then Luke, now you understand how Luke is uh, digging into the details, but you also know now that Luke is uh, uh, wanting to emphasize the literalness of the resurrection and appeal to the priesthood at the time, and why Luke doesn't mention Caiaphas's involvement. Um, and then finally, Yochanan, and you'll now understand why Yochanan opens up his gospel immediately talking in mystical terms about the incarnation of the Word and so on. And why, by the way, Yochanan is so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because the mystical meaning is so much deeper and so much different, if you will, from the lower three levels of understanding. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very much alike, and Yochanan is very different. Okay, I hope this has helped you out in your understanding of Scripture, and we'll get a new video out for you soon. Um, we do need to ask you one more time to consider financially supporting this work. Um, the free blogs that we produce, the commentary that we're putting online for free, the workup that we're doing on Nazarene Halacha online for free, all of which is at nazarenespace.com/blog. So please support this work with your donations, uh, tithes, offerings, or whatever types of donations that you feel like you can make. Um, and again, we'll put a link at the bottom of this video where you can just click and donate, or you can send by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Hopefully, we'll see you again soon in another video teaching. Shalom.